November 3, 1877, Charleston, South Carolina, 11:47 in the morning, beneath a sky choked with ash-gray clouds that refused to break, in the colored cemetery on the east side of Calhoun Street, where the earth still remembers chains and the wind still carries screams, a small pine coffin sat above a grave that had been dug too shallow. Inside that coffin lay Samuel Thorne, 8 years old, black as midnight, with eyes the impossible color of winter skies that had been closed by his mother's trembling hands 3 days prior. But at 11:47, those eyes opened, and the world would never explain what happened next. Samuel Thorne was no ordinary child, though the world tried to make him so. Born with irises that defied his bloodline, a genetic impossibility that made white men nervous and black folks whisper about jinn and changelings, he had been the subject of both wonder and cruelty. When he collapsed in the cotton field on October 31st, convulsing and choking on nothing, 3 doctors pronounced him dead. His skin had gone cold, his heart had stopped. The undertaker had prepared him, but death, it seemed, had made a clear error, and Samuel Thorne was about to become either a miracle or a curse, depending on who was telling the story, and what they had to lose. What you're about to witness isn't folklore dressed up as history. This is documented terror, the kind that made newspaper editors in 1877 burn their drafts rather than print the truth. Before we descend into the impossible, I need you to understand something. There are stories that demand witnesses, not just listeners. If you're ready to walk through this nightmare with me, if you're prepared to question everything you thought you knew about death, memory, and the cruelty of the living toward those who refuse to stay buried, then stay with me. Subscribe, because this journey doesn't end when Samuel opens his eyes, it begins there, and what comes next will haunt you long after you've closed this screen. The first sound was a scraping, fingernails against pine wood, soft at first, then frantic, a rhythm that made the gravediggers drop their shovels and step back from the mound of red Carolina clay they'd been preparing to heap upon the coffin. There were 4 men present, 2 gravediggers, both former slaves whose backs still carried the keloid memory of whips. Reverend Amos Blackwell, a freedman preacher whose faith had survived bondage but was about to be tested in ways Scripture never prepared him for, and Marcus Thurn, Samuel's father, a carpenter whose hands had built half the colored churches in Charleston, but couldn't build a world where his son's strange eyes didn't make him a target. Marcus heard at first that scratching and his knees buckled. He'd sewn the burial shroud himself, had placed pennies on those blue eyes that looked so wrong in his boy's beautiful face, had whispered prayers in Gullah that his own grandmother taught him, words older than slavery, older than Jesus, words meant to keep the dead at rest and the living safe from what comes back wrong. But Samuel was coming back. The scratching grew louder. The pine coffin sheet, because that's all Marcus could afford after the typhoid had swept through and taken his work for 3 weeks, began to shift. Not violently, almost gently, as if whatever was inside was being careful not to damage itself. Reverend Blackwell clutched his Bible so hard the leather binding cracked. One of the gravediggers, a man named Josiah who'd seen 2 of his children sold south before the war, started backing toward a cemetery gate, shaking his head, mumbling, "No sir, no sir, no sir," like a prayer to some god that predated the Christian one. The other gravedigger, younger, named Thomas, stood frozen, shovel raised like a weapon, his eyes wide enough to show the whites all around, and Marcus moved forward. Samuel, his voice cracked on the name, split down the middle like, "Greenwood Samuel baby, that you." The scratching stopped. For 5 seconds, the world held its breath. Even the wind died. Even the crows that had been circling those dark prophets that always know when death is near went silent and landed in the magnolia tree that shaded the colored section, watching with their oil-black eyes. Then the coffin lid exploded outward, and Samuel Thorne sat up, those impossible blue eyes blazing like gas flames in his small, dark face. He didn't gasp, and that's what Marcus would tell people later, in the weeks when he could still speak about it without his voice dissolving into something animal and broken. Samuel didn't gasp for air like a drowning man pulled from deep water. He simply sat up, smooth and deliberate, as if he'd been resting and had now decided the rest was finished. The burial shroud fell away from his shoulders, white cotton that Marcus had stitched with his own carpenter's precision, and beneath it, Samuel's skin looked wrong, not dead wrong, something else. It had a faint luminescence, like pearl shell held up to candlelight, and the veins beneath showed darker, more pronounced, mapping his small arms in deep purple rivers that pulsed with something that might have been blood but moved too slow, too thick. His clothes were the same ones he died in, simple homespun shirt and trousers that his mother Dinah had made from flour sacks, because that's what you did when freedom meant you were free to starve with dignity. But there was no dignity in what happened next. Samuel turned his head too far, almost owl-like, his neck rotating in a way that made Thomas the gravedigger vomit into the grass, and looked directly at his father. Those blue eyes, which had been a curiosity in life, were now something else entirely. They didn't reflect light anymore. They seemed to drink it, to pull the gray November sun into themselves and give nothing back. And there was knowledge in them, terrible, ancient knowledge that no 80-year-old child should possess, that no human being should possess, Papa Samuel said. And his voice was his own, but layered with something underneath, something that sounded like wind through a cave system, like water moving through underground channels where light has never reached. Papa, I was so far down. Marcus fell to his knees in the red clay, arms outstretched, caught between the primal urge to embrace his son and the screaming instinct that whatever was sitting in that broken coffin was no longer entirely his son. Reverend Blackwell began reading from Psalms, his voice climbing toward hysteria. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, but Samuel's head snapped toward him with that same unnatural rotation, and the Reverend's voice died in his throat like a candle snuffed between wet fingers. I've already walked through that valley, Samuel said softly, those blue eyes fixed on the preacher. And Reverend, there ain't no shepherd waiting on the other side, just doors. So many doors. Josiah ran. He didn't look back, didn't offer explanation or apology. He simply dropped his shovel and ran toward the cemetery gate with the speed of a man who'd spent his youth fleeing overseers and dogs. His footsteps echoed off the headstones, a frantic percussion that faded into the street beyond, where Charleston continued its Saturday morning routines, oblivious to the fact that resurrection, real, documented, impossible resurrection, was happening 300 yards away in the colored section, where decent white folks didn't venture unless they were lost or looking for trouble. Thomas stayed, but only because his legs had stopped obeying his brain. He stood there trembling, shovel still raised, watching as Samuel climbed out of the coffin with movements that were too fluid, too controlled. The boy's bare feet touched the red clay, and where they made contact, the earth seemed to recoil slightly, the moisture in the soil pulling away as if the ground itself recognized something fundamentally wrong. Samuel stood there in his flour sack clothes, head tilted at that awful angle, and smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile. That's what made it worse. It was gentle, almost apologetic. The smile of a child who knows he's caused inconvenience but doesn't quite understand why the adults are so upset. "Mama's crying," Samuel said, and he turned those light-drinking eyes toward the cemetery gate, toward the small wooden house 3 streets over where Dinah Thorne sat beside a cold stove, rocking back and forth, keening a grief song that her own mother had sung when the slavers came. "I can hear her from here. I can hear everything now, Papa, the worms in the ground singing about rot, the roots of the magnolia tree drinking from the graves, the rats in the church basement eating the communion wafers that Reverend Blackwell thinks he hid so good." He looked at the preacher, and Blackwell's Bible slipped from his hands, landing in the dirt with a sound like judgment. "It tastes like paper and broken promises. Reverend, the rats told me so." Marcus found his voice, though it came out "Samuel Beatty, what happened to you? Where did you go?" The boy's smile faded. His eyes, those impossible blue eyes, filled with something that might have been tears. Except tears don't move upward, don't defy gravity and slide back into the skull as if the body is drinking its own sadness. "I died," Papa Samuel whispered, "and dying showed me what living really costs." Marcus crawled forward on his knees, hands reaching, father instinct overriding the terror that made his bladder threaten to release and his heart slam against his ribs like a prisoner against cell bars. He touched Samuel's ankle, just the ankle. Couldn't bring himself to reach higher on. The skin was cold, but not corpse cold. It was the cold of deep wells, of January rivers, of places where the sun's warmth has never penetrated. Samuel looked down at his father's hand with an expression that carried more pity than any child should be capable of, and he placed his own small hand over Marcus's calloused fingers. "I saw them," Papa Samuel said, and his voice dropped lower, that wind-through cave sound growing stronger. "I saw the ones who came before, the ones who built this place before it was Charleston, before it was Carolina, before white men drew lines on maps and called it property." He gestured vaguely toward the earth beneath their feet, and Marcus felt something shift in the ground, not an earthquake, but a settling, as if the soil was listening, as if the dead buried here for decades were pressing closer to hear what the boy had brought back from the other side. "They're angry. Papa's so angry. The ground here is soaked in tears and blood and prayers that never got answered. Every brick in this city was laid on top of screaming. Did you know that? Did you know that when you walk down Meaton Street, you're walking on the compressed bones of people who prayed to gods that don't have English names?" Reverend Blackwell made a sound, not quite a word, more like a wounded animal trying to speak scripture and failing. Samuel's head rotated toward him again, and the boy's expression shifted into something that resembled sympathy but carried the weight of centuries. "Your God is real," Reverend Samuel said softly. "I met him down there, but he's tired, so tired. He's been carrying too much weight for too long, and his back is breaking under the prayers of people who suffer and keep expecting mercy that never comes." The boy paused, and his blue eyes seemed to pulse with a light that had no earthly source. "He asked me to tell you something, Reverend Blackwell," he said. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But I can't hold him back much longer." "Hold who back?" Marcus whispered, though every instinct screamed not to ask, not to know. Samuel smiled again, that gentle, terrible smile. "The ones who want their bodies back." Thomas finally moved. The shovel fell from his hands, clattering against a headstone, marked with a name that time and weather had erased, and he stumbled backward, his mouth working soundlessly like a fish drowning in air. Samuel watched him with those light-swallowing eyes, and for a moment just a flicker, something like recognition, passed across the boy's face, something human and young and confused, as if Samuel himself was struggling to understand what he'd become, what information was pouring through him from sources that had nothing to do with an 8-year-old child who'd picked cotton and played marbles and loved his mother's sweet potato pie. "I don't want to scare you," Samuel said, and his voice cracked on the words, becoming briefly the voice of a boy again, high and uncertain. "I don't want to be this." But they won't stop talking, Papa. All the voices. They're so loud. He pressed his small hands against his temples, and where his palms made contact with his skull, the skin beneath seemed to darken, to bruise in real time, purple and black, spreading like spilled ink. "There's a woman named Abba who was buried here in 1723. She remembers the crossing. She remembers the ship, the Henrietta Morand. She remembers the sharks that followed for 11 weeks, getting fat on bodies thrown overboard. She wants me to tell her story. Papa, she's screaming it inside my head." Marcus pulled his hand back, not in revulsion but in horror at what his son was carrying, at the weight of ancestral agony that had somehow chosen this child as its vessel. "Samuel, baby, we need to get you home. We need to get you to your mama. Let her see you breathing. Let her mama can't see me." Samuel interrupted, and his voice was layered again, that terrible harmonica boy, and something else, something vast and old. "Not like this. It would break her, Papa. What I've become would shatter her mind like glass under a hammer." He looked toward the street, toward the direction of their small house, and a single tear rolled down his cheek, but it was black, viscous, more like tar than salt water. "I can hear her heartbeat from here. I can count the beats, 117 beats per minute. That's fear, Papa. That's what a mother's heart sounds like when she's afraid her grief might have been a mistake." The magnolia tree rustled, though there was no wind, and the crows took flight as one, their wings creating a sound like tearing fabric. Dr. Nathaniel Crenshaw arrived 17 minutes later, summoned by Thomas, who'd finally found his legs, and his voice and head run screaming into the street about the dead boy walking in devils in the boneyard. Crenshaw was not a man easily moved by the superstitions of the colored population. He'd said as much at the Medical Society dinner just last Thursday, had laughed into his brandy about Negro hysteria and primitive belief systems, but he came because he was a man of science, and science demanded investigation even when the subjects were inconvenient and dark-skinned. He came in his black carriage with his black bag, stepping down onto Calhoun Street in his pressed suit and polished shoes. "You're Dr. Crenshaw," Samuel said before the man could speak. "You pronounced me dead on October 31st at 4:17 in the afternoon. You listened to my chest for 12 seconds. You checked my pupils for 8 seconds. You declared me deceased, and you charged my father $3 money he didn't have. Money he borrowed from the church fund, money that Reverend Blackwell will have to explain to the congregation." The boy tilted his head in that unnatural way. "You didn't check very carefully, did you, Doctor? You were in a hurry. You had dinner at the Charleston Hotel at 6 o'clock. Oysters and champagne. You laughed about the pickaninny with a weird eye to your colleague Dr. Morehouse. You said I was probably better off dead, because children like me, children born wrong only, bring suffering to their families." Crenshaw's face drained of color. His black bag slipped from his fingers, landing in the red clay with a heavy thud, instruments rattling inside like bones in a coffin. How? The doctor whispered. How could you possibly? Samuel smiled that terrible, gentle smile. I told you, Doctor. I can hear everything now. One of the police officers, a thick-necked Irishman named Callahan, who'd broken enough colored skulls to earn himself a promotion, stepped forward with his hand on his pistol grip. Now you listen here, boy, I don't know what kind of trick this is, what kind of voodoo nonsense your people are pulling. But he didn't finish. Samuel looked at him, just looked, and Callahan's hand fell away from his weapon as if the leather holster had suddenly become red-hot iron. The officer stumbled backward, his face contorting in pain, and he clutched at his chest, gasping. Your heart has a hole in it, Samuel said matter-of-factly, with the clinical detachment of a physician delivering diagnosis. A small tear in the left ventricle, probably from the rheumatic fever you had as a child in Dublin. You have maybe 8 months before it fails completely. You'll die in your sleep on a Tuesday morning next July. Your wife will find you cold in the bed and she'll weep, but only for an hour. Then she'll feel relieved, because you hit her. Officer Callahan, you've been hitting her for 6 years, and she's been praying for God to take you. God hurt her. I hurt her too. Callahan fell to his knees, making sounds like a stuck pig, and the second officer, younger, with a mustache he had grown to look older, backed toward the cemetery gate, his hand making the sign of the cross over and over, Catholic muscle memory, trying to ward off something his Baltimore catechism had never prepared him for. Dr. Crenshaw found his voice, though it emerged thin and reedy. This is impossible. Medically impossible. The boy was dead. I examined him myself. No heartbeat, no respiration, no corneal reflex. He stopped, staring at Samuel with the expression of a man watching his entire understanding of reality crumble into dust. What are you? Samuel's blue eyes softened with something that resembled sadness. I'm still your son, he said, looking at Marcus, ignoring the doctor entirely. I'm still the boy who helped you sand the pews for Reverend Blackwell's church. I'm still the boy who was afraid of thunder and loved Mama's singing. But I'm also... He paused, struggling for words, his small face contorting with the effort of translation, of putting the infinite into the vocabulary of an 8-year-old. I'm also a door that got left open, and things are coming through. Papa, so many things. The ground beneath the cemetery trembled, subtle but unmistakable. Somewhere in the colored section, a headstone that had stood for 40 years cracked down its center with a sound like a gunshot. Marcus found the courage that only fathers possess, the kind that doesn't erase fear but walks through it anyway. He crossed the distance between himself and his impossible son. He knelt before Samuel, eye level now, close enough to see that the boy's pupils weren't round anymore but slightly elongated. Vertical, like a cat's or a snake's. Close enough to smell him, not decay but something mineral and ancient, like wet stone in caves where no human foot has ever tread. Marcus reached out and cupped Samuel's face in both his carpenter's hands, those hands that had built pulpits and cradles and coffins, and he looked into those blue eyes that he'd been afraid of since the moment Samuel had been born, screaming into a world that would hate him for their strangeness. Then we close the door, Marcus said, his voice breaking but firm. If you're a door, baby, then we close it. We find a way. Samuel's expression crumbled. For one perfect moment he was just a boy, Angie, just an 8-year-old child who was frightened and confused and wanted his father to fix the unfixable the way fathers are supposed to. A sob broke from his throat, and when he pressed his face against Marcus's chest, the cold of his skin seeped through the fabric, through flesh, down to bone. But Marcus didn't pull away. He wrapped his arms around his son and held him while Samuel wept tears that came out wrong, black and viscous, and too warm, staining Marcus's shirt like ink, like oil, like the residue of whatever realm the boy had passed through. I can't close it, Papa, Samuel sobbed into his father's chest. It doesn't work like that. Death isn't a door with hinges. It's a threshold, and once you cross it, once you see what's on the other side, you can't unsee it. You can't unknow it. He pulled back, and his face was streaked with those black tears, and his blue eyes were wild with a knowledge that was destroying him from the inside. They're coming, Papa, all of them. Everyone who died wrong in this place. Everyone who was buried without names, everyone who screamed into pillows and dirt and darkness. They've been waiting so long for a crack in the wall. And I'm the crack, Papa, I'm the way through. Dr. Crenshaw backed away slowly, his scientific mind shattering like porcelain dropped on marble. We need to contain this, he whispered. We need to. God help us. We need to put him back in the ground. Marcus's head snapped toward the doctor. and his eyes held murder. "You touch my son, and I'll kill you where you stand." Word spread through the colored district like fire through dry grass. Within an hour, 40 people had gathered at the cemetery gate, some curious, some terrified, some drawn by a pool they couldn't name, an ancient magnetism in their blood that recognized something profound was happening in that boneyard, where their ancestors slept restlessly in unmarked graves. They came with conjure bags and Bibles, with roots wrapped in red flannel and crosses made from railroad spikes, with every protective charm that had survived the Middle Passage and slavery and reconstructions, broken promises, old women who remembered Africa through their grandmother's songs, young men who'd fought for the Union and come home to find freedom and you could starve legally, children who pressed against the iron fence, eyes wide, sensing but not understanding that the world was cracking open. Dinah Thorne came last, pushing through the crowd with the fury of a mother who'd been told her dead son was walking and no one, not God, not death, not the laws of nature, was going to keep her from him. She was 31 but looked 50, worn down by labor and loss, her hands calloused from washing white folks' clothes, her back bent from years of making herself small enough to survive. Boucher was a storm when she burst through that cemetery gate, and even the police officers stepped aside because some forces are more terrifying than any law. "Samuel!" she screamed, and the name tore from her throat like something physical, like her heart had climbed up a windpipe and launched itself into the gray November air. "Samuel Marcus Thorne, you answer your mama right now." The boy turned from his father's embrace, and when Dinah saw his face, saw those blue eyes that had always marked him as other, saw the black tears streaking his cheeks, saw the knowledge and agony carved into features that should have been smooth, Samuel's voice carried to every person gathered. "They didn't do anything to me, Mama. I did it to myself. I came back when I should have stayed gone." Night fell early that November 3rd, as if the sun itself wanted no part of what was unfolding. In Charleston's colored cemetery, by 4 o'clock, the sky had darkened to the color of old bruises, and a fog rolled in from the harbor, thick, unnatural, carrying the smell of salt and something older, something that reminded the oldest among the gathered crowd of the holds of slave ships, of bodies packed so tight you breathed your neighbor's last breath. The police had called for reinforcements. The mayor had been summoned. 3 white ministers arrived with holy water and crucifixes, prepared to perform an exorcism on what they assumed was a demon wearing a child's skin. They didn't understand. This wasn't possession. This was revelation. Samuel stood in the center of the cemetery now, and the ground around him had begun to sink, not collapse, but deflate, as if the earth itself was exhaling, releasing something it had held compressed for too long. The graves nearest to him showed signs of disturbance, soil shifting, headstones tilting, and from beneath the red clay came sounds that made grown men weep, scratching, tapping, the muffled percussion of hands against coffin wood, of the dead, testing their prisons, finding them subtly, impossibly weakened. "Make it stop," Reverend Blackwell pleaded, his voice hoarse from prayer. He'd been reciting scripture for 3 hours straight, every verse about resurrection and salvation he could remember, but the words fell dead in the air around Samuel, as if language itself had lost its power in the boy's presence. "In the name of Jesus Christ, make it stop." Samuel looked at him with eyes that now glowed faintly in the gathering darkness, twin blue flames that illuminated nothing but somehow made the shadows deeper. "Jesus was dead for 3 days, Reverend," the boy said softly. "I was dead for 3 days too. But Jesus came back with answers and forgiveness. I came back with questions and memory. Do you know what the difference is? Jesus was divine, and just a door." And Reverend Samuel's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every person present, that traveled through the fog like a living thing. "The hinges are breaking." Marcus still stood close to his son, refusing to abandon him even as fear clawed at his sanity. "Tell me what to do, Samuel. Tell me how to help you." The boy smiled, that heartbreaking, gentle smile. "You can't help me, Papa, but maybe I can help them. Maybe that's why I came back. Not for the living." He looked down at the shifting earth beneath his feet. "For the ones who never got to rest." A white man pushed through the crowd, not clergy, not police, but something worse. His name was Silas Pritchard, and he owned the land where Samuel had collapsed 3 days prior. Owned the cotton field where the boy had been picking from dawn until the moment his small body had convulsed and gone still. Pritchard was fit, barrel-chested, with mutton chops, gone gray, and eyes like chips of flint. He'd made his fortune on slave labor before the war and had transitioned smoothly to sharecropping after it. understanding that you didn't need chains when debt and starvation did the same work. He walked with a cane not because he needed it, but because he liked the sound it made, the authority of wood striking ground. The way Calariat stepped aside when they heard him coming, he didn't step aside now. He walked straight to Samuel, and his face held the contempt of a man who'd never been denied anything in his life. "This is some kind of trick," Pritchard announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some nigger magic show to get out of work, to claim injury, to sue for damages. I've seen it before. The boy's not dead, he was never dead. It's a con, and you're all fools for falling for it." Samuel's head turned toward Pritchard with that unsettling, too-far rotation, and the blue glow in his eyes intensified. When he spoke, his voice carried layers, not just wind in caves anymore, but specific voices, dozens of them, hundreds of them, all speaking in unison through the boy's throat. "You are Silas Pritchard. You are 63, not 58 to lie about your age because you are vain. You killed your first slave when you were 19, a boy named Moses who looked at your sister in a way you didn't like. You beat him to death with a shovel handle and buried him in the North Field, the same field where you plant tobacco now. His bones are still there, pressing up through the roots every spring, and you plowed them under every time, grinding them into powder. With your machinery." Pritchard's face went from red to white. His cane slipped from his fingers. "How? ... That's a lie." "I never. You're a liar and a murderer," Samuel said, and his voice was calm, factual, unburdened by judgment, because the dead don't judge, they only remember. "And you are going to die in 3 days, Silas Pritchard, not from illness, not from age, from guilt. Your heart will finally understand what your mind refuses to accept, and it will stop beating in protest of carrying you one more step." Pritchard stumbled backward, clutching his chest, his mouth working soundlessly, and the crowd parted around him like water around a stone. "Stop. Breathe. Let me ask you something before we go further into this nightmare, before we cross the threshold. That Samuel Thorne has cracked open. Do you feel it? That cold recognition crawling up your spine? That ancestral knowing that whispers some stories aren't meant to be forgotten, that some truths demand witnesses across generations? You're standing at the edge of something that Charlton tried to bury in 1877, something that newspapers refused to print, that history books conveniently lost in margins and footnotes. If you're here, truly here, if you understand that what we're watching isn't entertainment but testimony, then you need to commit to scry, not for me, but because these voices that speak through Samuel deserve an audience beyond the grave. Comment below. Tell me what justice looks like for the ones who died wrong. Share this story with someone who needs to know that death isn't always the end, and sometimes resurrection is the cruelest mercy. Now let's finish what Samuel started. It began at midnight, the hour when the veil is thinnest, when even skeptics cross themselves and children wake from nightmares they can't name. Samuel had been sitting motionless for 7 hours, cross-legged on the sunken earth, his blue eyes fixed on some horizon that existed in a dimension the gathered crowd couldn't perceive. Marcus sat beside him, hand resting on his son's shoulder, refusing to leave even though Dinah had begged him to come home, to let the ministers handle it, to stop touching the boy who was no longer entirely a boy. But Marcus was a father before he was anything else, and fathers don't abandon their children to darkness, even when, especially when the darkness is living inside them. The first grave opened at 12:03 a.m. Not violently. There was no explosion of soil, no skeletal hands bursting through earth like in the penny dreadfuls that white folks read to scare themselves before bed. Instead, the ground above Martha Wickham's resting place, she'd been buried in 1861. A midwife who'd delivered half the colored babies in Charlton before yellow fever took her simply deflated, collapsed inward, and from the depression rose something that wasn't quite smoke and wasn't quite form. It had the suggestion of a woman's shape, translucent and shimmering like heat waves off summer pavement, and it hovered above the grave for a moment before drifting towards Samuel, moving with purpose, with intention, with 16 years of pent-up speech. Then another grave opened, and within 10 minutes, the entire colored section of the cemetery was exhaling its dead. Not bodies, the corpses stayed buried, stayed rotted and gone, but something else. Echoes, impressions, the psychic residue of lives lived in bondage and terror and stolen joy, of people who died with words stuck in their throats, with stories untold, with rage that had nowhere to go but down into the earth, where it had festered and concentrated and waited for a crack in the world. They came to Samuel like iron filings to a magnet. These remnants of the dead, These ghosts that weren't quite ghosts. They swirled around him in a vortex of memory and anguish, and as each one touched him, the boy's body jerked, his mouth opened, and voices poured out, not his voice, but theirs. Dozens, speaking simultaneously in languages that predated English, in Gula and Igbo and Yoruba and Wolof, in the mother tongues that slavery had tried to beat out of existence but couldn't quite kill. The crowd scattered. Some ran. Some fell to their knees in prayer. Some stood transfixed, recognizing voices they thought they'd never hear again. Grandmas, fathers, children taken too soon, and they wept with a grief that was also relief because the dead were finally speaking. Dr. Crenshaw tried to run. He made it 7 steps before one of the translucent forms, this one shaped vaguely like a man, tall and broad-shouldered, drifted in front of him and solidified just enough to be seen clearly. The doctor stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet, landing hard on his tailbone in the red clay. The form hovering before him had no face. Not exactly, but there was the impression of features, of eyes that had witnessed too much, of a mouth that had swallowed too many screams. Samuel's head snapped toward the doctor, and when the boy spoke, it wasn't his voice anymore. It was deeper, rougher, carrying the accent of someone who'd learned English as a third language, who'd been stolen from home at 14 and died at 29 in a rice field with water in his lungs and a white man's boot on his neck. "You are a doctor?" the voice said through Samuel's mouth. "You take an oath? First, do no harm." "But you did harm, didn't you, Dr. Crenshaw? You experimented on us, on the ones who couldn't say no, who had no rights, whose bodies you bought from the auction block specifically because you wanted to see what would happen if you operated without anesthesia, if you could perfect your surgical techniques on flesh that the law said wasn't quite human." Crenshaw's face had gone the color of old paper. That was medical science. That was necessary for the advancement of 12 people, Samuel interrupted, and the voice coming from him was now multiplied. A chorus of the Violitas speaking in terrible harmony. 12 of us you cut open while we were awake and screaming. You wanted to study the threshold of pain, wanted to document how much agony the human body could endure before the mind fractured. You published your findings in the Journal of Southern Medicine in 1849. You were celebrated, given awards. Never once mentioned that your subjects were slaves, were property, were people who begged you to stop in languages you pretended not to understand. The translucent form drifted closer to Crenshaw, and where it passed near him, the doctor's skin began to bruise, dark purple blossoms appearing on his hands and face as if the ghost was showing him, making him feel every incision, every violation, every moment of agony he'd inflicted in the name of progress. Crenshaw screamed. It was a sound of pure animal terror, the cry of a man confronting the calcified evil he'd convinced himself was righteousness. He tried to crawl away, fingers digging into the dirt, but the form followed him, patient and relentless as Karma Makut watched with his jaw clenched, his hand still on Samuel's shoulder, feeling his son's body shake with the effort of channeling so many voices, so much rage. "Samuel Beatty, this is killing you. You have to stop." Samuel's nose began to bleed not red blood, but that black viscous substance that was becoming his new normal, the fluid of whatever realm he'd brought back with him. It poured down his face, over his lips, dripping onto his flour sack shirt in thick drops that looked like oil in the moonlight. His small body trembled, his spine arching backward in a way that should have broken bones, and Marcus held on tighter, anchoring his son to the world of the living even as the dead tried to pull him deeper into their realm of testimony and reckoning. "I can't stop, Papa," Samuel gasped in his own voice. Young and terrified and in pain, "They won't let me stop. They've been silent for so long, decades. Some of them, and now they have a mouth again, and they're going to use it until there's nothing left of me to use." Another convulsion racked his small frame. "Papa, I'm so tired, and they just keep coming, keep pushing through me, and I can see what they saw, feel what they felt, and Papa, it hurts so bad. It hurts worse than dying. It hurts Dinah." With push through the remaining crowd, past the police officers who'd given up trying to maintain order, Samuel collapsed into his mother's arms, and for the first time in 3 days, he felt warm, human warm, living warm. Dinah held him and sobbed racking sobs of relief and terror and gratitude while Marcus wrapped his arms around both of them, creating a fortress of family against the darkness that still pressed close. Dr. Crenshaw lay unconscious in the dirt, his face covered in bruises that would never fully heal, that would ache on cold mornings for the rest of his short life. He would die 8 months later, not from the encounter but from the guilt it awakened, from the memories it forced him to confront. They buried Samuel Thorne again on November 10, 1877, 7 days after his first resurrection, 3 days after his second death. This time, there was no doctor's examination, no certificate, no official record. The boy simply closed his eyes on the morning of November 7th while sitting at his mother's kitchen table, eating the sweet potato pie she'd made because it was his favorite, and he smiled at her, a real smile. Uncomplicated by the weight of the dead hand, he said, "Thank you, Mama," and then he was gone. Just gone. His body remained, but whatever had made Samuel Samuel, whatever spark of consciousness that had traveled through death and back again, had finally, mercifully, moved on. The newspapers never reported it. The medical society never investigated. The police files that mentioned the incident on November 3rd mysteriously disappeared from the precinct records, and the officers who'd been present were reassigned to distant posts or quietly retired. Charlton had decided, in the way cities do when confronted with truths that threaten their carefully constructed narratives, that Samuel Thorne had never existed. The boy with the impossible blue eyes who came back from the dead became a story told in whispers, a legend shared in colored churches and around kitchen tables, a ghost story that was more true than any history book would ever admit. But the dead remembered. In the colored cemetery on Calhoun Street, the ground stayed settled after that night, stayed quiet, as if some ancient agreement had been reached, some cosmic debt partially paid. And sometimes, on November 3rd, when the fog rolls in from the harbor and the air smells like salt and memory, people walking past that cemetery swear they can hear a child's voice speaking in languages that have no name, telling stories that have no end, bearing witness to suffering that time has tried and failed to erase. Samuel Thorne became a myth, a cautionary tale, a promise. The boy who loved his mother's pie and feared thunder, who picked cotton with small hands and died too young and came back wrong and chose love over prophecy. He became the patron saint of all the silenced voices, the keeper of stories too terrible to forget and too true to tell. His grave bears no marker. His name appears in no official record, but in the hearts of those who understand that some doors, once opened, can never fully close. Samuel Thorne walks eternal not as a ghost, but as a reminder that the dead are patient, that truth is inevitable, and that resurrection, when it comes, rarely looks like mercy, it looks like reckoning. And reckoning, my friends, is a debt that compounds with interest across centuries, waiting for the day when another door cracks open and the silenced finally, gloriously, speak.